The coffee had gone cold in my hands before I realized I'd been staring at the same page of the newspaper for 20 minutes. The sports section, meaningless box scores from games I hadn't watched, but my eyes weren't really seeing them anyway. They were seeing the empty chair across from me at the kitchen table, the one where Margaret used to sit with her crossword puzzle and her reading glasses perched on her nose, humming some old tune I could never quite identify. 3 years since the cancer took her, and I still set out 2 mugs every morning out of habit, still caught myself buying her favorite yogurt at the grocery store, still reached for the phone to call her when something funny happened on the evening news. The house held onto her presence like morning mist holds onto grass. You know it's not really there anymore, but you can feel it if you don't think too hard about it. The oak kitchen table beneath my elbows was the same one we'd bought at an estate sale 42 years ago, when we were young and broke and thought matching furniture was a luxury we'd figure out someday. Margaret had fallen in love with the way the grain ran through the wood like rivers on a map, and I'd fallen in love with the way her face lit up when she traced those lines with her fingertip. "This table's going to hold a lot of life, Frank," she'd said, and she'd been right. Birthday cakes and homework battles, Thanksgiving dinners that ran too long, late-night talks over whiskey when the kids were finally asleep. Now, it mostly held my solitude and yesterday's mail. The house around me breathed with the settled patience of old wood and older memories. 43 years we'd lived here, raised our boy Ethan in these rooms, watched him grow from a gap-toothed kid building Lego castles on this very kitchen floor to a man with his own family and his own problems. The walls held the pencil marks where we'd measured his height each birthday, the small dent in the hallway where he'd crashed his bicycle that Christmas morning when he was 7. Margaret had wanted to repair it, but I'd talked her out of it. Some damage is worth keeping, I'd told her, and she'd kissed my cheek and called me sentimental. I took a sip of the cold coffee and grimaced. Margaret would have made me a fresh cup without being asked. She always knew when I needed things before I knew it myself. The garage door rumbled open, cutting through the morning quiet like a chainsaw through silk. I glanced at the clock on the microwave, 9:47 a.m. Too early for visitors, too late for deliveries. The sound of car doors slamming echoed off the concrete walls, followed by voices, familiar ones. My chest tightened with something that might have been anticipation, or might have been dread. I'd learned to distrust the difference. Through the kitchen window, I watched Ethan emerge from his silver SUV, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than my monthly electric bill. Behind him came Madison, his wife of 6 years, her blonde hair caught up in one of those effortless styles that took an hour to achieve. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd never had to wonder if she belonged in any room she entered. And behind them, emerging from the back seat like dignitaries at a state dinner, came Madison's parents, Gerald and Patricia Whitmore. The Whitmores. I'd met them exactly 4 times in the 6 years since the wedding, and each encounter had left me feeling like a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room. Gerald was the kind of man who wore sweater vests unironically and spoke about investment opportunities the way other people talked about the weather. Patricia had mastered the art of smiling while looking through you, as if you were a window she was trying to see past. I set down my coffee mug harder than necessary, the ceramic clicking against the wood with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. Whatever this was, it wasn't a social call. Ethan hadn't visited in 8 months, hadn't called in 6. The last time we'd spoken, it had been about Margaret's jewelry, whether I was ready to distribute her things yet. I'd told him no, and he'd gotten that tight look around his eyes that meant he was calculating something I wouldn't like. The front doorbell rang, followed immediately by knocking, firm, insistent knocks that suggested whoever was on the other side didn't intend to wait long for an answer. I made my way through the living room, past the Afghans Margaret had crocheted during her chemotherapy treatments, past the bookshelf filled with her romance novels and my westerns, past the wedding photo on the mantel where we both looked impossibly young and certain that love was enough to solve any problem that might come our way. The image caught my eye as it always did, Margaret in her grandmother's dress, me in a rented tuxedo that was too big in the shoulders, both of us grinning like we'd just gotten away with something magnificent. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. I opened the door to find my son standing on the front porch with his wife and in-laws arranged behind him like a small army. Ethan's smile was bright and sharp, the kind of expression that belonged in a boardroom or a sales pitch. Dad, he said, stepping forward with his arms extended for a hug. I wasn't sure I wanted to give. You look good. Really good. I let him embrace me, feeling the expensive fabric of his polo shirt against my cheek, smelling the cologne that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Ethan, I said, stepping back, this is unexpected. The best surprises always are, Madison chimed in, her voice carrying that musical quality that made everything sound like a performance. She kissed my cheek with lips that smelled like vanilla and false warmth. Frank, you look wonderful. Doesn't he look wonderful, Gerald? Gerald stepped forward with his hand extended, gripping mine with the kind of firm handshake that was supposed to convey authority. Frank, good to see you. Patricia and I were just saying we don't visit nearly enough. Patricia's smile could have powered a small town. The house looks exactly the same, she said, peering past me into the living room. So, quaint. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Quaint. That was rich coming from someone whose idea of decorating involved buying everything from the same catalog. Come in, I said, because Margaret would have haunted me if I left guests standing on the porch, even guests I didn't want. Coffee's on, if anyone wants some. Actually, Dad, Ethan said, his hand finding my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like steering than affection. We wanted to talk to you about something important, something that affects all of us. We settled in the living room, them on the couch Margaret and I had picked out together 20 years ago. Me in my reading chair with its view of the backyard, where she'd planted roses that still bloomed every spring, despite my clumsy attempts at gardening. The space felt smaller with 4 extra people in it, the air thicker with whatever agenda they had brought through my front door. Dad, Ethan began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped in the posture of a man about to deliver serious news. We've been talking, all of us, about your situation here. My situation? I kept my voice level, but something was starting to coil tight in my chest. Madison's smile never wavered. Living alone in this big house, Frank. It must be so lonely for you. So much maintenance, so many memories that must be difficult. Gerald nodded gravely. At our age, we all need to start thinking practically about housing, about what makes sense for our needs and our safety. Your age? I looked at Gerald, who couldn't have been more than 65. What's this about? Ethan glanced at Madison, some silent communication passing between them. The thing is, Dad, Gerald and Patricia are between living situations right now. Their lease is up next month, and with the housing market the way it is. We thought, Patricia interrupted, her voice warm as honey over broken glass, that it might be mutually beneficial for all of us. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I looked from one face to another, seeing the careful expressions, the rehearsed concern, the way they all leaned forward slightly as if they were about to close a business deal. You want to move in here? I said. It wasn't a question. Temporarily, Madison said quickly, just until they find something suitable. And honestly, Frank, wouldn't it be nice to have people around? To not have to worry about maintaining this place all by yourself. I maintain it just fine. Of course you do, Ethan said, his tone sliding into the patient register people use when they're talking to children or the very old. But Dad, be realistic. This house is too big for one person, too isolated. What if something happened? What if you fell or had another episode with your heart? Another episode. The phrase hit me like a slap. I'd had one mild heart palpitation 18 months ago, stress from sorting through Margaret's things, and somehow that had become a chronic condition in my son's narrative. I'm 71, not 91, I said, and my heart is fine. Still, Patricia said, glancing meaningfully at the family photo on the side table, Margaret wouldn't want you struggling alone. She'd want you somewhere safe, somewhere you could enjoy your golden years without all this responsibility. The mention of my wife's name in that context, spoken by a woman who'd met her exactly twice, sent a surge of anger through my chest, hot enough to make my hands clench. But I kept my voice steady. What exactly are you proposing? They exchanged looks again, that silent choreography of a conversation that had been rehearsed without me. Well, Ethan said, we were thinking you might be more comfortable in one of those nice senior communities. You know, with activities and meal service and people your own age to socialize with. While they stay here. It makes sense, Frank, Gerald said, leaning back as if the matter were already settled. Young families need space to grow, and you'd have so much less to worry about. I sat back in my chair, feeling the familiar give of the cushions Margaret had recovered 3 times over the years, always in different patterns, but always in colors that made the room feel warm. I looked at the built-in bookshelves I'd installed myself, at the hardwood floors we'd refinished together one summer when Ethan was away at camp, at the stone fireplace where we'd hung our stockings every Christmas and roasted marshmallows on winter nights. And if I say no, the silence that followed was answer enough. I could see it in Ethan's set jaw, in Madison's careful smile, in the way Patricia's eyes had already started cataloging which of Margaret's things would need to go. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice carrying a warning I was apparently supposed to understand. "We're trying to help you. We're trying to make this easy." Easy for whom? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing Ethan's face. This wasn't the boy who'd cried when our dog died, who'd brought Margaret dandelions from the yard every Mother's Day, who'd called me every week during his first year of college because he was homesick. This was someone else entirely, someone who could sit in the house where he'd been raised and calmly discuss dismantling everything his parents had built. "I need some time to think about it," I said finally. "Of course," Madison said brightly. "Take all the time you need, within reason." They stayed for another hour, making small talk that felt like sandpaper on raw wood. Patricia complimented Margaret's decorating choices while mentally rearranging everything. Gerald asked about my retirement finances with a casual air of someone inventory someone else's belongings. Madison kept mentioning how much character the house had, as if character were something that could be appraised and sold. And Ethan watched me with the patient calculation of a man waiting for an old animal to lie down and stop fighting. When they finally left, the house felt different, violated somehow, as if they'd opened drawers and read my mail while I wasn't looking. I sat back down at the kitchen table and stared at the cold coffee in my mug, at the empty chair where Margaret used to sit, at the pencil marks on the doorframe that measured 43 years of life, lived in rooms that somebody wanted to take away from me. I thought about Margaret's last words, whispered in the hospital room, while machines beeped their electronic lullabies around us. "Take care of our home, Frank. Promise me you'll take care of what we built." I'd promised her, and I'd meant it. But as I sat there in the growing afternoon shadows, listening to the house settle around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, I realized that keeping that promise was going to be harder than I'd ever imagined. Because the threat wasn't coming from strangers or developers or natural disasters. It was coming from the boy I'd raised, the man I'd trusted, the son who'd just looked me in the eye and told me, in so many words, that my life as I knew it was over. The first crack had opened, and I could feel everything else beginning to shift. Have you ever experienced a situation similar to this story? Tell everyone about it. The silence after they left was different from the usual quiet of the house. This wasn't the comfortable solitude I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years, the peaceful absence of conversation, the freedom to eat dinner at 5:30 or midnight without explaining myself to anyone. This was the hollow silence that follows a verdict, the kind that makes you understand that something fundamental has shifted, and there's no going back to the way things were before. I sat at the kitchen table until the shadows grew long across the linoleum floor, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light that slanted through Margaret's lace curtains. She'd made those curtains herself during the winter. Ethan turned 16, back when his biggest rebellion was staying out 20 minutes past curfew and forgetting to call. I remembered how proud she'd been of the delicate pattern, how she'd stood back with her hands on her hips and declared them just perfect for this room. Everything in this house carried her fingerprints, her choices, her touch. The blue ceramic sugar bowl shaped like a rooster that we'd bought on our anniversary trip to Mexico. The quilted placemats she'd sewn from fabric scraps left over from Ethan's bedroom curtains. The small herb garden outside the window where she'd grown basil and thyme and rosemary, explaining to anyone who'd listen that fresh herbs made all the difference between a meal and a memory. I found myself walking through the rooms like a man taking inventory before a fire, seeing each object with new eyes. The oak coat rack by the front door where Margaret's blue winter coat still hung. I hadn't been able to bring myself to donate it. couldn't bear the thought of some stranger's hands in her pockets where she'd kept butterscotch candies and tissues, and the small leather address book she'd carried for 30 years. The antique rocking chair in the corner of the living room where she'd nursed Ethan as a baby, where she'd later sat reading him bedtime stories, where she'd dozed during her last months when the treatments left her too tired to climb the stairs to our bedroom. In the garage, my workbench still held the Christmas ornament she'd been repairing when she got too sick to finish, a small wooden angel with a broken wing that had belonged to her grandmother. I'd kept telling myself I'd fix it someday, but my hands had never been as gentle as hers, never had that patient touch that could mend delicate things without breaking them further. The phone rang as I stood there holding the angel, its painted face worn smooth by decades of Christmas trees and careful packing away. The caller ID showed Ethan's name, and for a moment I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe he'd called to apologize, to say they'd gotten carried away. That family meant more than real estate. Dad? His voice sounded different over the phone, less polished, more like the boy I remembered. I wanted to make sure we're okay, about this afternoon. I set the angel down carefully on the workbench. Are we? Of course we are. Look, I know it's a big change to think about. But Dad, you have to admit it makes sense. The house is too much for you to handle alone, and Gerald and Patricia really do need a place to stay. It could work out perfectly for everyone. There was that word again. Everyone. I noticed it didn't include me. Ethan, I said slowly, this house isn't too much for me. I built half of it with my own hands. I know every creak in the floorboards, every quirk of the plumbing. I know which window sticks in the rain and which door needs an extra push to close properly. I know, Dad. I remember. But maintaining a house and living alone in it are two different things. What if something happens? What if I live my life the way I choose to live it? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. What if I stay in the home I built with your mother, surrounded by 40 years of memories that mean something to me? Silence stretched between us, filled with everything we weren't saying. The thing is, Ethan said finally, his voice taking on that careful tone again. We've already started making arrangements. Gerald and Patricia's lease is up in 3 weeks, and they need to know where they're going to be living. Started making arrangements, without asking me, without including me in the decision, as if my opinion about my own home was a formality they could handle later. I never said they could move in here. Dad, be reasonable. Where else are they going to go? Do you want to see family homeless? Family. That was rich, coming from a man who'd visited 4 times since his mother died. I want to see family acting like family, I said, not like real estate agents. Another silence, longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had cooled several degrees. We'll talk more about this later, when you've had time to think it through properly. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood in the garage for a long time after that, surrounded by the tools I'd accumulated over 40 years of home ownership. The circular saw I'd used to build Ethan's treehouse, the drill that had hung Margaret's pictures on every wall, the level that had helped me install the kitchen cabinets where she'd stored her good china and her everyday dishes side by side, because she'd never seen the point in saving beautiful things for occasions that might never come. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door working in her garden, her gray hair tied back in the same style she'd worn for the 20 years I'd known her. Helen Patterson had been Margaret's closest friend, the woman who'd brought casseroles during the worst of the treatments, who'd sat with her during chemotherapy sessions when I had to work, who'd held my hand at the funeral when the words caught in my throat and I couldn't finish the eulogy I'd written. I walked over to the fence that separated our yards, needing to talk to someone who'd known Margaret, someone who remembered what this place had been like when it was still a home instead of a piece of property to be redistributed. Frank, Helen said, looking up from her roses with soil-stained gloves and a sad smile. I saw the fancy car earlier. Family visit? Something like that. I leaned against the fence post, feeling the familiar give of wood that had weathered 40 Missouri winters. Helen, do you remember when we first moved in here? How Margaret planted that oak tree by the front porch because she said every house needed something that would outlive the people who built it. Helen straightened, studying my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried 1 husband. I remember. She was so excited about that little sapling, couldn't wait to see how big it would grow. What's wrong, Frank? I told her about the visit, about the suggestion that I needed to downsize. about Gerald and Patricia's convenient housing crisis. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Well, I'll be damned," she said when I finished, using the kind of language Margaret used to scold her for. "That boy of yours has some nerve, I'll give him that. Coming into your house, the house Margaret loved, and talking about moving you out like you're some piece of old furniture that doesn't match the decor anymore. They think they're helping. Horse feathers." Helen pulled off her gardening gloves with sharp, angry movements. "They think they're inheriting. There's a difference." The truth of that hit me harder than I'd expected. Inheriting. As if I were already dead. As if my life were already over, and they were just waiting for the paperwork to be filed. "Margaret wouldn't stand for this," Helen continued. "She'd march right over to that boy's house and give him a piece of her mind that would curl his hair. And she'd be right to do it." I thought about Margaret's temper, the rare but memorable occasions when her patience finally snapped, like the time the insurance company tried to deny coverage for my heart medication, or when Ethan's high school principal suggested he wasn't college material because he'd been caught smoking behind the gymnasium. Margaret could be soft as butter and tough as nails, sometimes in the same conversation. "What are you going to do?" Helen asked. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. What was I going to do? Roll over and let them pack me off to some sterile apartment where the walls held nobody's memories but mine? Smile and nod while strangers moved into the bedroom where Margaret and I had planned our dreams and mourned our losses? "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not going quietly." Helen smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. "Good. Margaret didn't raise a quitter, and she sure as hell didn't marry one." That evening, I made myself a simple dinner. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes. The kind of meal Margaret used to call comfort food for the soul. I ate it at the kitchen table, looking at the empty chair across from me, and trying to remember what she'd said about standing up for yourself, about not letting people walk all over you, just because they were family. "Family doesn't give you the right to be cruel," she'd told me once, during one of Ethan's more selfish phases as a teenager. "Being related to someone doesn't mean you owe them everything you've worked for." After dinner, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, though I still couldn't think of it that way. Margaret's perfume bottles still lined the dresser, her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside her bookmarked Bible. I'd left everything exactly as it was the day she died, partly because I couldn't bear to disturb it, and partly because some stubborn part of me kept expecting her to come back and need her things. I opened the closet and pulled out the fireproof safe where we'd kept our important documents. Inside were the deed to the house, our marriage certificate, my discharge papers from the Army, and the will Margaret had insisted we draw up after her diagnosis. "I want everything crystal clear," she'd said. "No confusion, no fighting, no questions about what belongs to whom." The deed was in both our names, but with right of survivorship that meant it passed entirely to me when she died. The house was mine, legally and completely. Ethan could suggest and manipulate and guilt all he wanted, but he couldn't force me to leave, not unless I chose to go. I sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 40 years, holding the deed in hands that trembled slightly with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Outside, the oak tree she'd planted rustled in the evening breeze, its branches now tall enough to scratch against the bedroom window during storms. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start making some phone calls. To my lawyer, to my banker, to anyone who could help me understand exactly what my options were. Because if Ethan thought he could pressure me into giving up everything Margaret and I had built together, he was about to discover that his old man still had some fight left in him. The last thing I did before turning out the light was to touch Margaret's pillow, still holding the faint scent of her lavender shampoo. "I won't let them take it, honey," I whispered to the darkness. "I won't let them take what we made." And for the first time since the afternoon's visit, I slept soundly. I woke before dawn with the kind of clarity that comes after a sleepless night spent wrestling with hard truths. The house was still dark, wrapped in that particular silence that belongs to the hours when the world hasn't quite decided to start moving again. But my mind was already racing, already planning, already calculating the distance between where I was and where I needed to be. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen, while I stood at the window watching the sky lighten over Helen Patterson's garden. She'd be up soon, too. Helen was an early riser, Had been for the 30 years I'd known her. Margaret used to joke that Helen and I kept the same schedule because we were both too stubborn to admit we were getting old, too set in our ways to sleep past 6:30, even when we had nowhere particular to be. My first call was to Tom Brennan, my lawyer. Tom and I had served together in Vietnam, and when he came back, he'd used his GI benefits to get through law school, while I'd used mine to learn the construction trade. We'd stayed friends through marriages and divorces, kids and grandkids, the slow accumulation of years that either bind men together or drive them apart. Tom was the kind of lawyer who still made house calls and still charged fees that wouldn't bankrupt a working man. Frank, his voice was gravelly with sleep and 30 years of cigarettes. It's not even 7 in the morning. This better be good. It's not good, I said. It's family. That changed his tone immediately. Tom had been through his own family wars, a messy divorce, a son who'd stolen money from his business, a daughter who'd married 3 times and blamed her father for each failure. He understood that blood didn't automatically confer loyalty. What's going on? I told him about yesterday's visit, about the casual way they'd discussed relocating me, like I was a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room. Tom listened without interrupting, making the occasional grunt that told me he was taking notes. "They can't force you to sell," he said when I finished, "not unless they can prove you're mentally incompetent, which would require a court hearing and medical testimony. But, Frank, they can make your life pretty miserable if they're determined to push this." "How miserable?" "Depends how creative they want to get. Constant visits, family pressure, maybe claims that you're not maintaining the property properly or that you're a danger to yourself. The fact that your daughter-in-law's parents need housing gives them a sob story to work with." I thought about Patricia's calculating eyes, about the way she'd cataloged Margaret's decorating choices, like a real estate agent staging a house for sale. What are my options? Legally, you tell them no and you mean it. Practically, you might want to think about making some changes that would make it harder for them to pressure you later. What kind of changes? Tom was quiet for a moment, the kind of pause that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "Frank, you and Margaret own that house free and clear, right? No mortgage, no liens. Paid it off 15 years ago. Then you have options. You could transfer the deed to a trust with yourself as trustee, which would make it harder for anyone to challenge your ownership. You could add some legal language about who has access to the property. Hell, you could donate it to charity and retain a life estate if you wanted to really throw a wrench in their plans. Donate it to charity. The idea had a certain poetic justice to it. Margaret had always been generous with local causes, had volunteered at the food bank and donated to the animal shelter even when money was tight. She'd have appreciated the irony of thwarting Ethan's greed while helping people who actually needed assistance. "Let me think about it," I said. "But Tom, I want you to draw up some papers that make it crystal clear who owns this house and who has the right to live in it. Consider it done, and Frank, change your locks. Today." I hung up feeling like I'd taken the first real step forward since yesterday's ambush. Tom was right about the locks. If they were serious about moving Gerald and Patricia in, they'd need keys. And if Ethan still had the spare key we'd given him years ago. The locksmith arrived at 10:30, a cheerful young man named Dave who whistled while he worked and told me stories about the rise in break-ins in the neighborhood. "Folks getting desperate," he said, installing the new deadbolt on the front door. "Economy's got people doing things they never thought they'd do." I thought about that while he worked. Was that what this was? Economic desperation driving my son to treat his father like an inconvenience to be managed? Or was it something deeper? Some fundamental shift in how he saw family, how he measured worth and obligation. "You want me to rekey the back door too?" Dave asked. "Might as well do the whole house while I'm here." "Do it all," I said. "Every lock in the place." While Dave worked, I walked through the house again, seeing it with new eyes, not just as the repository of 40 years of memories, but as a piece of property worth protecting. The hardwood floors I'd refinished twice, the kitchen cabinets I'd built by hand, when Margaret complained that the original ones were too shallow for her mixing bowls. The bathroom I'd remodeled when her arthritis made it hard for her to step over the old tub's high sides. Every room held projects I'd completed, problems I'd solved, improvements I'd made, because this wasn't just where we lived, it was what we'd built together, brick by brick, board by board, year by year. It wasn't just a house, It was proof that we'd existed, that our marriage had meant something, that Margaret's life had mattered. Dave finished with the locks and handed me a small envelope containing the old keys. "What should I do with these?" I asked. He shrugged. "Most folks throw 'em away. No point keeping keys that don't open anything anymore." I looked at the keys in my palm, including the brass spare that Ethan had carried since high school, the one that had given him access to come and go as he pleased, to treat this place as an extension of his own space rather than his father's home. "Yeah," I said, "no point at all." After Dave left, I made lunch and tried to concentrate on the baseball game on the radio, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation with Tom, to the legal documents that could protect what Margaret and I had built. Around 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. This time I looked through the peephole before answering. Ethan stood alone on the porch. No Madison, no in-laws, just my son in a polo shirt and khakis looking like he was heading to a country club meeting. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Dad," he said, his smile bright but strained around the edges. "I wanted to stop by and continue our conversation from yesterday. I think we got off on the wrong foot." "Did we?" "Well, yeah, I know change is hard, but I was hoping we could talk about this like adults, work out something that makes sense for everyone." There was that word again. Everyone. "What did you have in mind?" Ethan glanced past me into the house, and I saw the moment when he noticed the locksmith's work, the shiny new deadbolt, the different finish on the door handle. Did you change the locks?" "I did." "Why would you do that?" I looked at my son, standing on the porch of the house where he'd been raised, asking me to explain why I'd secured my own home against unwanted intrusion. "Because it's my house, Ethan. My name on the deed, my mortgage payments for 30 years, my sweat equity in every room. And I got the feeling yesterday that some people might have forgotten that." His face flushed red. "Dad, you're being paranoid. We're family. Why would you need to lock us out?" "I'm not locking you out. I'm making sure I control who comes in." We stared at each other across the threshold. 43 years of father and son condensed into this moment of understanding that something fundamental had changed between us. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice taking on that patient tone again, "you're not thinking clearly about this. Gerald and Patricia have already given notice on their apartment. They've already started packing. We can't just leave them hanging. You should have asked me before making those arrangements." "We didn't think—" "No," I cut him off. "You didn't think. You assumed. You assumed this was your decision to make, your property to distribute, your right to decide how I should live the rest of my life." Ethan stepped closer to the door, and for a moment I saw something in his face that reminded me of the tantrums he'd thrown as a small child when he couldn't have what he wanted. "Dad, be reasonable. This house is too big for you. You rattle around in here like a marble in a shoebox. And face it, you're not getting any younger. What happens when you can't manage the upkeep? What happens when you fall down those stairs or have another heart episode and there's nobody here to help you? Then I deal with it, like an adult, like someone who's been taking care of himself since before you were born. That's not realistic. You know what's not realistic?" I felt my voice rising and made a conscious effort to keep it level. "Expecting me to give up everything I've worked for because your in-laws made some poor financial decisions. Expecting me to smile and nod while you erase 40 years of my marriage to make room for people who barely know my name. They're family now. No, Ethan, they're your family. Margaret and I, we're your family. This house, the life we built here, the memories that live in every room, that's your family. But you want to throw it all away for what? For convenience? For some twisted idea of practicality?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. And you're making it easier than it should be." We stood there for a moment longer, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like smoke. Finally, Ethan shook his head. "I hope you change your mind," he said, "because one way or another, this is going to get resolved." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I watched him walk back to his car, watched him sit behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. As he drove away, I noticed Helen Patterson standing in her front yard, pruning shears in her hand, watching the entire exchange with the sharp attention of someone who'd seen this particular drama play out before. She walked over to the fence after Ethan's car disappeared around the corner. "How'd that go?" she asked. "About like you'd expect." Helen nodded grimly. Frank, you might want to think about getting some witnesses to whatever happens next. Boys like that, when they don't get their way, they tend to get creative about making sure they do. That evening, I sat at Margaret's desk in the small den off the living room, writing down everything that had happened over the past 2 days. Times, dates, exact words when I could remember them. If this was going to turn into a fight, I wanted documentation. As I wrote, I thought about Margaret's last months, how she'd insisted on updating our wills and organizing all our important papers. I want everything clear as crystal, she'd said. No confusion, no fighting over what belongs to whom. She'd been trying to protect me, I realized. Even then, even sick and weak and facing her own mortality, she'd been thinking ahead to the battles I might have to fight alone. Well, I wasn't alone, not completely. I had Tom, I had Helen, I had the law on my side, and 40 years of sweat equity in my favor. And I had something else too, the absolute certainty that Margaret would never forgive me if I let them win. I finished my notes and locked them in the desk drawer with the new keys Dave had given me. Tomorrow, I would start making this official. Paperwork, legal documents, whatever it took to make sure that the house Margaret and I had built remained exactly where it belonged. In my hands, under my control, protected from anyone who thought blood gave them the right to erase a lifetime of love and work. The war had begun, and I intended to win it. Quiet of morning, but the charged stillness that comes before a storm. I sat in Margaret's recliner, my recliner now, though I still thought of it as hers, with a glass of whiskey and the photo album she'd kept of Ethan's childhood. The pictures told a story I'd almost forgotten. Here was Ethan at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the tool belt I'd made him for his birthday so he could help me build the back deck. There he was at 8, standing proudly beside the birdhouse we'd constructed together, his small hands still covered in wood stain, despite Margaret's best efforts to keep him clean. At 12, holding up the base he'd caught off the dock at Lake Taneycomo, both of us sunburned and exhausted, and happier than we'd been all summer. When had he stopped wanting to build things with me? When had help Dad become a chore instead of an adventure? I traced my finger over a photograph of Ethan's 16th birthday party, looking for signs of the change that must have been coming. But all I could see was a lanky teenager trying to look cool while secretly pleased that his friends thought his old man was okay. Margaret appeared in many of the pictures, always slightly out of focus because she'd been the one behind the camera, but sometimes caught in candid moments, kissing Ethan's scraped knee, helping him with homework at this very kitchen table, standing between her husband and son with her arms around both of us like she could hold our little family together through sheer force of will. She died believing she had. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a clean burn, honest and straightforward in a way that reminded me of simpler times. Margaret hadn't approved of my drinking, not disapproved exactly, but worried about my heart, about the example it set for Ethan. Everything in moderation, Frank, she'd say when I reached for a second glass, including moderation. I'd cut back for her, switched to beer mostly, saved the whiskey for special occasions and difficult conversations. Tonight felt like both. The phone rang just before 10 o'clock. Not Ethan this time, Madison. Her voice was honey-sweet with just enough steel underneath to let me know this wasn't a social call. Frank, I hope I'm not calling too late. I know you're an early sleeper. I wasn't, particularly, but I let it slide. What can I do for you, Madison? Well, I wanted to follow up on yesterday's conversation. Ethan mentioned you had some concerns about the timeline, and I thought maybe we could work through those together. Timeline. As if my resistance was simply a matter of scheduling. Madison, I don't have concerns about the timeline. I have concerns about the plan. Oh. A pause, the sound of her recalibrating. Well, I can understand that. Change is always difficult, especially at your stage of life. But, Frank, you have to see that this arrangement would benefit everyone involved. There was that word again. Everyone. In Madison's vocabulary, it seemed to include everyone except me. How exactly would it benefit me to give up my home? Well, you wouldn't be giving it up exactly. You'd still own it, technically. Gerald and Patricia would just be staying there temporarily. And think about it. You'd have help with maintenance, someone to keep an eye on things, people around in case of emergencies. Isn't that what Margaret would have wanted, for you to be safe and cared for? The casual invocation of my dead wife's name, spoken by someone who'd met her maybe a dozen times, hit me like a slap. Margaret would have wanted me safe, yes, but she also would have wanted me to maintain my dignity, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life. Madison, I said, keeping my voice level, Margaret would have wanted me to do what I thought was best. And what I think is best is keeping things exactly the way they are. But Frank, the conversation is over, Madison. I'm not moving out of my house to make room for your parents. Find another solution. I hung up before she could respond, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. Madison wasn't the type to accept no gracefully, and she had the patience of someone who'd never had to work for what she wanted. She'd find another angle, another approach, another way to make me understand that resistance was futile. I poured another whiskey and returned to the photo album. Here was Ethan's high school graduation, all of us dressed up and proud, Margaret in the blue dress she'd bought, especially for the occasion. Ethan had been accepted to state on a partial academic scholarship. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to make college possible for a family like ours. I'd worked extra hours that summer, taken on weekend projects, done whatever it took to make up the difference. Education is the one thing nobody can take away from you, I'd told him the night before he left for freshman year. Money can disappear, jobs can end, but what you learn becomes part of who you are. He'd nodded seriously, promised to work hard, to make us proud. And he had at first. Dean's List his first semester, regular phone calls home, visits that felt like celebrations rather than obligations. But somewhere during college, something had shifted. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits more perfunctory. By senior year, he was already talking about career opportunities in cities I'd never seen, about making connections and building networks and all the things that sounded important but felt foreign. Margaret had worried about losing him to that world, to the pull of ambition and status that seemed to grow stronger every year. He's finding his way, she'd tell me when I expressed my own concerns. All kids have to figure out who they want to be. He'll come back to us. But he hadn't. Not really. He'd come back for holidays and special occasions, but the boy who'd wanted to build things with his hands had been replaced by a man who built things with PowerPoint presentations and networking events. The change had been gradual enough that we'd told ourselves it was natural, normal, the inevitable result of education and exposure to different ways of thinking. Now, I wondered if we'd been watching our son disappear one visit at a time. I closed the album and climbed the stairs to the bedroom, my knees protesting each step the way they had for the past few years. Getting old was a series of small surrenders, Margaret used to say. The trick was knowing which battles were worth fighting. In the bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled out the box where Margaret had kept her most precious things. Not jewelry or expensive items, but the accumulation of a life shared with someone she loved. Letters I'd written her during my brief deployment to Germany in the early years of our marriage. Ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together. The hospital bracelet from the day Ethan was born. A pressed flower from our wedding bouquet. Now brown and fragile, but still recognizable as a rose. At the bottom of the box was something I'd forgotten about. A letter Margaret had written to Ethan on his 18th birthday, but never given him. She'd shown it to me at the time, unsure whether her words would be welcome or if they'd sound like the meddling of an overprotective mother. I unfolded the letter carefully, the paper soft with age, and read her neat handwriting by the light of the bedside lamp. My dearest Ethan, by the time you read this, you'll be starting a new chapter of your life, and your father and I couldn't be prouder of the young man you've become. You have your dad's steady hands and his sense of right and wrong, and I hope you have a little bit of my stubbornness when it comes to protecting the people you love. The world is going to try to tell you that success means leaving behind where you came from, that growing up means outgrowing the values your parents taught you. Don't believe it. The most successful people I know are the ones who remember where they started and who helped them get there. Your dad built this house with his own hands because he wanted to give us something solid, something that would last. Not just the wood and brick and mortar, but the idea that a family could build something together that was bigger than any of us alone. That's what home means. Not just a place to live, but a place where love lives too. Someday you'll have your own family, your own dreams to build. When that time comes, I hope you'll remember that the strongest foundations are built on respect and gratitude, and the understanding that we all stand on the shoulders of the people who loved us first. All my love, Mom. I read the letter twice, hearing Margaret's voice in every word, feeling her presence in the wisdom she'd tried to pass on to our son. She'd never given him the letter because she'd worried it would sound preachy, but reading it now, I wondered if things might have been different if Ethan had understood what we'd been trying to build all those years, what we'd hoped to leave him. Not just a house, but a legacy. Not just property, but the understanding that some things were worth preserving, worth protecting, worth fighting for. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Tomorrow I would call Tom again, start the process of making my ownership of this house so ironclad that no amount of family pressure or emotional manipulation could shake it. I would document everything, prepare for whatever campaign Ethan and Madison might launch next. But tonight, I would sit with Margaret's memory and the photographs of the boy Ethan used to be, and try to remember what it felt like when building something together was more important than tearing it apart. Outside, a car drove slowly past the house, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom window. It might have been nothing, a neighbor coming home late, a delivery driver checking addresses, but something made me get up and look outside, and I saw the taillights pausing at the corner before disappearing around the bend. I made a mental note to mention it to Helen in the morning. If this was going to escalate, I wanted witnesses. I wanted people who knew the truth about what was happening, who could stand up and say that Frank Dalton had been a good neighbor, a responsible homeowner, a man who'd earned the right to live his life on his own terms. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the gentle creak of wood adjusting to the night's cooling temperatures, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. These were the sounds of home, the audio signature of a place where two people had loved each other for 40 years and raised a child who'd once been the center of their universe. I wasn't giving that up. Not for convenience, not for practicality, not for the wounded feelings of people who thought family was something you could leverage rather than something you protected. Margaret was gone, but her love remained in every board I'd nailed, every room we'd painted together, every decision we'd made to turn a house into a home, and I would defend that love with everything I had left, even if it meant defending it against our own son. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I recognized the number. It was my bank. Sarah Chen, the branch manager who'd handled our accounts for the past 15 years, sounded apologetic but professional. "Mr. Dalton, I'm sorry to call so early, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something unusual. Yesterday afternoon, someone came in asking about your accounts, claiming to be concerned about your mental state and ability to manage your finances." I set down my coffee mug harder than necessary. "Someone? Your son, actually, Ethan Dalton. He had identification, knew your social security number, seemed genuinely worried. He asked if we'd noticed any unusual activity, any signs that you might be struggling with financial decisions." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing, of course. We can't discuss account details with anyone but the account holder, family or not. But Mr. Dalton, it struck me as odd. Your accounts are in perfect order, always have been. You're one of our most reliable customers. Thank you for letting me know, Sarah. There's more. He also asked about safety deposit boxes, whether you'd been in recently, whether you'd made any large withdrawals or transfers. When I couldn't answer his questions, he mentioned something about possibly needing to take over your financial affairs for your own protection. The words hit me like a physical blow. Financial affairs, protection, the groundwork for a competency challenge, the legal framework that could strip away not just my house, but my independence, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life. "I appreciate the warning," I said. "And Sarah, if anyone else comes asking questions about my accounts, family, or otherwise, I want to be notified immediately." "Of course. And Mr. Dalton, you might want to consider updating your account security, maybe adding some additional protections." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with the house's settling foundation. This wasn't just about housing anymore. This was about control, complete, total control over every aspect of my life. I thought about the car that had driven slowly past last night, about Madison's honey-sweet voice discussing timelines, about the calculating look in Patricia's eyes as she'd surveyed Margaret's decorating choices. They weren't just planning to move into my house. They were planning to move me out of my own life. The second call came an hour later. Dr. Martinez, my physician for the past 12 years, sounded puzzled rather than alarmed. "Frank, I had an unusual visit yesterday. Your son came by, very concerned about your mental health. He wanted to know if I'd noticed any signs of cognitive decline, any changes in your behavior that might indicate dementia or Alzheimer's." My grip on the phone tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The same thing I tell everyone who asks about my patients without permission. Nothing. But Frank, he seemed to think you'd been acting erratically, making poor decisions, showing signs of confusion or memory loss. He even suggested I might want to schedule a comprehensive cognitive evaluation." "And what's your professional opinion about my mental state, Doc?" Dr. Martinez chuckled. "That you're sharper than most people half your age. You've never missed an appointment. You manage your medications perfectly. You ask intelligent questions about your health. If you're losing your mind, you're doing it more competently than most people live their lives. But you could be pressured to order an evaluation, not without cause. And Frank, there's no cause. But I wanted you to know what was happening in case there are other conversations you need to have. Other conversations, like the one I needed to have with Tom Brennan, immediately." Tom's office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind of place where the wooden floors creaked with authority, and the law books looked like they'd been read rather than displayed. I'd been there enough times over the years, for my will, for property transfers, for the legal housekeeping that comes with a long life responsibly lived, that the secretary waved me through without announcement. "Frank," Tom said, looking up from a stack of documents, "you look like a man who's had some bad news." I told him about the bank visit, the doctor's office, the systematic campaign to establish grounds for a competency challenge. Tom listened with the stone-faced attention of a man who'd seen this particular play run before. "How long since Margaret died?" he asked when I finished. 3 years next month." "And how long since Ethan's been pressing about the house?" "Started seriously this week, but looking back, there have been hints for months. Comments about my living alone, questions about whether I was managing okay, suggestions that I might want to simplify my living situation." Tom nodded grimly. "Classic pattern. They establish a timeline of decline, gather evidence of poor judgment, build a case that the elderly person needs protection from their own decisions. The fact that he's involving medical professionals and financial institutions tells me this isn't impulsive. This is planned. Can they succeed? Depends. Do you have any documented health issues that could be twisted into cognitive problems? Any financial missteps they could point to? Any witnesses who might testify that you've been acting strangely?" I thought about my careful management of the household finances, my regular medical checkups, my stable routines that had kept me functioning through 3 years of grief. "Nothing I can think of." "Then they'll have to manufacture something. And Frank, that's where this gets dangerous. If they're desperate enough to go this route, they might be desperate enough to create the evidence they need." "What kind of evidence?" Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Staged incidents, situations where you appear confused or disoriented, witnesses who can testify to concerning behavior, financial transactions that seem impulsive or irrational." "You're talking about entrapment." "I'm talking about family members who want something badly enough to destroy the person standing in their way." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. I thought about Ethan as a child, the boy who'd cried when our dog died, who'd insisted on saying grace at family dinners even through his rebellious teenage years. When had that boy become someone capable of this kind of calculated betrayal? What do I do? Well, first, we make it legally impossible for them to challenge your competency without overwhelming evidence. I'm going to draw up some documents that establish your current mental state, your decision-making capacity, your clear understanding of your financial and property interests. We'll have them witnessed and notarized, create a paper trail that shows you're thinking clearly about your future. And then we wait and we document everything. Every phone call, every visit, every attempt to pressure or manipulate you. If they're building a case against you, we're going to build a better case for you. I left Tom's office with a thick folder of documents to review and sign, and a growing sense that I was in a war I'd never wanted to fight. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of the neighborhood where Margaret and I had lived for 4 decades, I felt something else too: determination. They wanted to play legal games? Fine. I'd spent 71 years learning how to protect what I'd worked for. I wasn't about to stop now. The house felt different when I pulled into the driveway. Not threatened exactly, but alert. Like it was waiting for the next move in a chess game where the stakes were everything I'd built with the woman I'd loved. Helen Patterson was working in her front yard, but she straightened when she saw me park. We met at the fence that had separated our properties for 20 years, the same fence where Margaret and Helen had shared gossip and garden advice, and the comfortable friendship of women who'd raised their children side by side. "You look like you've had a morning," Helen said. I told her about the bank call, the doctor's visit, Tom's warning about manufactured evidence. Helen's expression grew darker with each detail. "That son of a bitch," she said, with the kind of language Margaret had always pretended to disapprove of. "Excuse my French, Frank, but that's exactly what he is. Going behind your back to your bank, your doctor, that's not concern, that's reconnaissance. Tom thinks they might try to stage something, create evidence that I'm not thinking clearly." Helen's eyes sharpened. "Then we need to make sure there are witnesses to everything that happens around here. Real witnesses, not the kind they can buy or intimidate." That evening, I sat at Margaret's desk and began writing. Not just notes about phone calls and visits, but a detailed account of my daily life, my routines, my decision-making processes, evidence of competency, documented in my own hand, dated and detailed enough to counter any claims of confusion or decline. June 15th. Balanced checkbook, paid utilities, scheduled routine maintenance for HVAC system, discussed property taxes with county assessor's office, grocery shopped, prepared meals, maintained household without assistance. June 16th. Met with attorney Tom Brennan regarding estate planning and property protection, reviewed legal documents, asked appropriate questions, made informed decisions about future plans. Bank manager called to report unauthorized inquiry into accounts by son Ethan. It felt strange, documenting my own competency like evidence in a trial that hadn't happened yet. But Tom was right. If they were building a case against me, I needed to build a stronger case for myself. The phone rang as I finished writing. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Dalton, this is Carol Stevens from Peaceful Meadows Senior Living Community. I understand you might be interested in touring our facilities." I'd never heard of East Peaceful Meadows, had never expressed interest in any senior living community. "I think you have the wrong number." "Oh, I don't think so. Your son Ethan contacted us just today. He said you were looking for a place with full-service care, somewhere you could feel safe and supported. We have a lovely unit available, and I'd be happy to show it to you this week." The pieces clicked into place, not just laying groundwork for a competency challenge, but preparing my next living situation, choosing where I'd go once they'd succeeded in removing me from my own home. "Ms. Stevens," I said, my voice calm despite the rage building in my chest, "I am not interested in your facility. I did not authorize my son to make inquiries on my behalf. Please remove my name from your contact list." "But Mr. Dalton, your son seemed very concerned about your current living situation. He mentioned that you'd been having some difficulties managing on your own." I hung up before she could finish. Then I called Tom Brennan's emergency number. "Tom, they're not just building a case for incompetency. They're choosing my prison." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Frank, I think it's time we stopped playing defense and started taking some offensive action of our own." "What do you have in mind?" "Trust documents, property transfers, legal maneuvers that will make it impossible for them to get what they want, even if they succeed in having you declared incompetent." "Do it," I said, "all of it." "Frank, once we go this route, there's no going back. You'll be burning bridges with your son that can never be rebuilt." I looked around the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee, where we'd planned our dreams and weathered our sorrows, where she'd held my hand the night before her last surgery and made me promise to take care of our home. "Tom," I said, "some bridges deserve to be burned." The setup came 3 days later, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. I was in the garage, organizing Margaret's garden tools, a task I'd been putting off for 3 years, when I heard the familiar rumble of multiple car doors slamming. Through the small window, I could see them assembling on my front lawn like a delegation: Ethan and Madison, Gerald and Patricia, and 2 people I didn't recognize. a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, and a man in a cheap suit who had the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. I took my time walking to the front door, partly because my knees were stiff from crouching in the garage, and partly because I wanted to watch them organize themselves. They stood in a loose semicircle on the lawn, their body language suggesting this was a planned intervention rather than a social visit. The woman with the clipboard was gesturing toward the house, making notes about God knows what, while the man in the suit nodded with the practiced sympathy of a funeral director. Helen Patterson had noticed the gathering too. She stood at her front window, coffee mug in hand, her expression sharp with the kind of attention that meant she was memorizing faces and taking mental notes. When she saw me looking, she raised her mug in a small salute that somehow conveyed both solidarity and readiness for battle. I opened the front door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch in my work clothes, paint-stained jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. If they wanted to stage a confrontation, I'd give them one that looked authentic. "Well," I said, loud enough for Helen and any other neighbors to hear clearly, "this is quite a welcoming committee. Should I be honored or worried?" Ethan stepped forward, his expression a careful blend of concern and determination. "Dad, we need to talk, all of us together, about your situation here." "My situation?" I let my voice carry just a hint of confusion, playing into whatever narrative they had prepared. "What situation would that be?" The woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. "Mr. Dalton, I'm Carol Stevens from Peaceful Meadows Senior Living. We spoke on the phone earlier this week. I'm here to conduct a preliminary assessment of your current living conditions and care needs." So, that was their play. An on-site evaluation by a senior care professional, witnessed by family members, documenting whatever evidence of decline or incompetence they had planned to manufacture. "I told you on the phone, Ms. Stevens, that I'm not interested in your services. I understand, sir, but your family has expressed some concerns about your ability to maintain this property safely. With your permission, I'd like to take a quick look around, just to put everyone's minds at ease. And if I refuse permission..." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad, why would you refuse unless you have something to hide?" The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Refuse the assessment and appear paranoid or defensive. Allow it and give them the opportunity to document whatever problems they had planned to discover. "I don't have anything to hide," I said, stepping back and gesturing them inside. "Please, come in, look around, see how the crazy old man lives." They filed into my living room like a funeral procession, their eyes already cataloging details, looking for evidence to support whatever conclusions they had reached before arriving. Ms. Stevens made notes on her clipboard, while Gerald and Patricia examined Margaret's decorating choices with the calculating attention of people planning renovations. "Mr. Dalton," Ms. Stevens began, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your daily routine, just to get a sense of how you're managing." "Fire away." "Do you prepare your own meals?" "Every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes I even remember to eat them." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face at my tone. She made a note. "And you handle your own financial affairs? Checkbook balanced to the penny every month. Bills paid on time. Investments managed conservatively, but competently." More notes. "What about household maintenance? Cleaning, repairs, yard work?" "I built half of this house with my own hands, Ms. Stevens. I think I can manage to keep it standing." Ethan stepped in, his voice carrying that patient tone that suggested I was being difficult. "Dad, be honest. Haven't there been times when you've felt overwhelmed, when the upkeep has been more than you could handle?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the calculation behind his concern. This was the moment they'd been building toward, the opening where I was supposed to admit weakness, confusion, inability to cope. "Ethan," I said clearly, "the only thing that's overwhelming me right now is the number of people in my living room trying to convince me I'm incompetent." Ms. Stevens glanced up from her clipboard. "Mr. Dalton, no one is suggesting you're incompetent. We're simply exploring options that might make your life easier, safer, more social. By moving me out of my home, by considering alternatives that might better serve your needs as you age." Madison had been quiet until now, but she chose this moment to speak up. "Frank, we've found a lovely place for you to visit. Peaceful Meadows has beautiful apartments, meal service, activities. You'd have people your own age to talk to. staff available if you need help with anything. And you'd have my house available if you need somewhere to live." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Gerald's face reddened slightly. Patricia's smile became more fixed. Ms. Stevens made another note, probably about hostility or paranoia. "Dad," Ethan said, "that's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" I walked to the mantel and picked up the wedding photo of Margaret and me, looking impossibly young and certain that love could conquer anything. "Let me tell you what this is about, son. This is about the fact that your in-laws need a place to live, and you've decided my house would be convenient. This is about the fact that you see an old man rattling around in too much space instead of seeing a widower living with 40 years of memories. This is about the fact that you think grief and loneliness are the same thing as incompetence." Ms. Stevens stepped forward. "Mr. Dalton, grief can certainly affect our judgment, our ability to make clear decisions about our future needs." "My judgment is fine," I cut her off. "Clear enough to see that this isn't an assessment, it's an ambush. Clear enough to recognize that you've already written your report before you've seen how I live." I set Margaret's photo back on the mantel and turned to face them all. "Let me save everyone some time. I'm 71 years old, not 91. I'm healthy, competent, and financially secure. I live in the house I built with my wife, surrounded by 40 years of memories that mean more to me than your convenience or your housing needs. I prepare my own meals, manage my own affairs, and maintain my own property. I have no intention of moving to Peaceful Meadows or anywhere else, and I have no intention of turning my home into a boarding house for people who think family means free rent." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Helen Patterson's screen door slamming. She walked across her front yard to stand at the fence between our properties, close enough to hear every word. "Everything all right over there, Frank?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Just fine, Helen. Just having a family discussion about property values and personal independence." Helen nodded. "Well, if you need anything, another witness, a character reference, someone to call the police, you just holler." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Ms. Stevens glanced nervously toward the window, suddenly aware that this private assessment had become a public performance. Gerald cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside, without the whole neighborhood listening." "Oh, I don't mind the neighborhood listening," I said. "In fact, I prefer it. I've got nothing to hide, and it's always good to have witnesses when family members are trying to pressure elderly relatives into making decisions that benefit everyone except the elderly relative." Ethan's face was red now, his careful composure cracking. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you." "Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for? Abandon the home I built with your mother? Pretend that 40 years of marriage can be erased by your convenience? This house is too big for you. This house is exactly the right size for my life. You're alone here. I'm alone everywhere, son. The difference is, here I'm alone with memories that matter, surrounded by things your mother and I chose together, living in rooms where we were happy. You want to trade that for a sterile apartment where I can sit around with strangers pretending that socialization is the same thing as belonging." Miss Stevens was writing furiously now, probably documenting hostility, agitation, resistance to reasonable suggestions. But her notes wouldn't capture the real story, the story of a man defending his right to grieve on his own terms, to live with his memories intact, to die in the place where he'd been happiest. "Mr. Dalton," she said carefully, "I understand that change is difficult, but sometimes our attachment to a place can become unhealthy. Sometimes we cling to the past in ways that prevent us from moving forward." I looked at her with the kind of patience you reserve for children and fools. "Ms. Stevens, I'm not clinging to the past. I'm living in the present, in the home I choose to live in, making decisions about my own life that don't require anyone else's approval. If that seems unhealthy to you, I'd suggest the problem isn't with my mental state. It's with your understanding of what independence looks like." Patricia had been examining Margaret's china cabinet during this exchange, and now she spoke up. "Frank, honestly, you have to see that rattling around in this big house isn't good for you. And some of these things, Margaret's things, they're just gathering dust. Wouldn't it be better to let them go to family members who would appreciate them?" The casual greed was almost refreshing in its honesty. At least now we weren't pretending this was about my welfare. "Patricia," I said, Margaret's things will stay exactly where they are until I decide otherwise. And that decision will be made by me, not by a committee of people who think inheritance is the same thing as entitlement. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the arrival of Tom Brennan's car in my driveway. Tom emerged from his sedan carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd come to finish unpleasant business. "Frank," he said, ignoring the small crowd on my front lawn, "sorry I'm late. Are these the people you wanted me to meet?" The question was innocent enough, but it shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Suddenly, I wasn't a confused old man being pressured by concerned family members. I was a property owner with legal representation, someone who'd anticipated this confrontation and prepared for it. "Tom," I said, "meet my son Ethan and his family, and Ms. Stevens from Peaceful Meadows, who's been conducting an assessment of my living situation." Tom nodded politely to each of them, then turned back to me. "Are you ready to proceed with the documents we discussed?" "Absolutely." Ethan stepped forward, suspicion and alarm clear in his voice. "What documents?" Tom smiled with the professional courtesy of a man who'd spent 40 years in legal battles. "Property protection documents, trust agreements, powers of attorney that specify exactly who can and cannot make decisions about Mr. Dalton's affairs. Standard precautions for a man of his age and assets." The words hit the group like individual slaps. Ms. Stevens closed her clipboard with a sharp snap. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances that spoke volumes about collapsed plans. Madison's carefully composed expression cracked just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. And Ethan looked at me with something that might have been respect, if respect could be mixed with that much anger. "Dad," he said, "you can't do this." "I already have," I replied. "The papers were filed this morning." It wasn't entirely true. Tom and I still had paperwork to complete, but the bluff served its purpose. The delegation that had arrived to pressure a helpless old man was now facing a property owner with legal protection and professional representation. "I think," Tom said mildly, "this would be a good time for everyone to take a step back and consider their next moves very carefully." They left in a convoy of mutual recrimination and barely suppressed fury. I watched from my front porch as they conducted a heated discussion in Ethan's SUV, gestures flying, voices raised enough to carry across the lawn without revealing words. Helen Patterson appeared at my side, having somehow crossed the yard without my noticing. "Well," she said with satisfaction, "that was quite a show. You think they'll be back?" I watched the SUV pull out of my driveway, Ethan's face set in lines I recognized from his childhood tantrums when he couldn't have what he wanted. "Oh, they'll be back," I said. "But next time, they'll be dealing with someone who's ready for them." The war wasn't over, but the first real battle had been won. The silence that followed their departure was different from any quiet I'd known in 3 years. Not the hollow emptiness of grief, not the charged stillness before a storm, but something new. The profound calm that comes when you stop fighting yourself and start fighting for yourself. I sat on the front porch swing that Margaret and I had installed 20 years ago. The same swing where we'd watched summer thunderstorms roll across the valley, where we'd shared morning coffee on countless peaceful weekends, where she dozed during her last good spring while I read the newspaper aloud and pretended not to notice that she wasn't really listening anymore. Helen Patterson walked over with 2 glasses of iced tea, settling beside me on the swing with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend who knew when conversation was needed and when silence would do. "How are you feeling?" she asked, after we'd sat quietly for several minutes. I considered the question seriously. How was I feeling? Relieved, certainly, vindicated. But underneath those immediate emotions was something deeper, something I hadn't felt since Margaret's funeral, a sense of my own solid ground beneath my feet. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in months, maybe years, I feel free." Helen nodded. "Margaret would be proud of you." Would she? I wasn't fishing for reassurance, but genuinely wondering. Margaret had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises that let everyone save face. Would she have approved of this confrontation, this definitive severing of the threads that had connected our family? "Frank," Helen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd known my wife as well as anyone. "Margaret spent 40 years watching you build things with your hands. houses, furniture, that beautiful garden trellis she loved so much. But the most important thing you ever built was your integrity. She wouldn't want you to tear that down just to keep the peace with people who don't respect what it cost you to build it. The truth of that settled into my bones like warmth from a good fire. Margaret had loved me for who I was, not for who I might become if I bent myself into shapes that pleased other people. She'd married a man who worked with his hands and spoke his mind, who believed that some things were worth defending even when the cost was high. I keep thinking about something she said near the end, I told Helen. We were talking about Ethan, about how different he'd become, and she said, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. I didn't understand what she meant then. And now I think she was preparing me for this, telling me it was okay to say no, even to family, especially to family. The afternoon passed quietly. Tom called to confirm that the trust documents were properly filed, that my property and financial assets were now protected by legal structures that would be nearly impossible to challenge. A few neighbors stopped by. Word had traveled quickly through our close-knit community about the morning's drama. Each visitor brought the same message in different words. They'd been watching, they'd seen what happened, and they supported my right to live my life on my own terms. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 houses down brought a casserole and a story about her own son's attempts to pressure her into selling her home after her husband died. I told him the same thing you told yours, she said with fierce satisfaction. My house, my rules, my decision. Bill Morrison, the retired postal worker who lived at the end of the street, stopped by with an offer to help with any heavy maintenance work I might need. Some of us older folks need to stick together, he said. Can't let the young ones push us around just because they think they know better. Even Father Mackenzie from St. Michael's, where Margaret had been a faithful parishioner for 30 years, made an unexpected visit. I heard you had some family difficulties, he said, with the diplomatic understatement that clergy perfected. I wanted you to know that standing up for your principles, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, is sometimes the most Christian thing you can do. By evening, I realized that what I'd thought of as isolation, the quiet life of a widower managing alone, had actually been community. These people had been watching out for me, caring about my welfare, ready to support me when I needed it. I hadn't been alone at all. I'd just been too focused on the family that was pulling away to notice the neighborhood that was gathering close. The phone rang during dinner, my simple meal of soup and sandwiches, eaten at the kitchen table while watching the evening news. For a moment, my heart jumped, wondering if it might be Ethan, if he'd reconsidered, if there was still a chance to rebuild something from the wreckage of the morning. But it was Madison's voice, crisp with barely controlled fury. Frank, I think you should know that what you did today was cruel and unnecessary. Gerald and Patricia are devastated. They're family, and you've basically told them they don't matter to you. I set down my spoon carefully. Madison, what I told them is that they don't get to make decisions about my life. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you'd rather live alone in that big empty house than help family members who need you. From where I'm sitting, it looks like family members who need me would ask for help rather than try to take what they want by force. We weren't taking anything by force. You brought a stranger into my home to evaluate my competency without my consent. You made inquiries about my financial affairs behind my back. You contacted senior living facilities and presented my relocation as a done deal. If that's not force, it's fraud. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was colder. You're going to regret this, Frank. When you're sitting alone in that house, when you have no family left who cares about you, when you're just another lonely old man with no one to call, you're going to remember this day and wish you'd been more generous. Madison, I said quietly, if generosity means giving up everything I've worked for to accommodate people who see me as an obstacle rather than a person, then I'm comfortable being selfish. This time, she did hang up. I finished my dinner in peace, then spent the evening going through Margaret's papers, not to organize them or prepare them for distribution, but simply to remember. Here were the love letters I'd written her during my brief deployment overseas early in our marriage. Here were the poems she'd copied from books and magazines, verses about enduring love and quiet happiness that had spoken to her. Here were the recipes she'd clipped and modified, annotated with notes about what worked and what needed adjustment. A life documented in small details, in the accumulation of choices and preferences and daily acts of care. This was what they had wanted me to abandon, not just a house, but the physical evidence that Margaret and I had existed, that our marriage had mattered, that love could be measured in kitchen curtains and garden plans and 40 years of morning coffee shared at the same oak table. I found myself thinking about Ethan's childhood again, but this time without the sharp edge of betrayal that had colored my memories recently. There had been good times, genuine love, moments of connection that couldn't be erased by what came after. The boy who'd helped me build the backyard deck still existed somewhere inside the man who'd tried to evict me from my own home. But that boy had grown into someone I didn't recognize, someone whose values had shifted so far from mine that we no longer spoke the same language about family, loyalty, or responsibility. Maybe that was okay. Maybe some relationships weren't meant to survive the stresses of adult life, the competing demands of marriage and career, and the subtle pressures that came with wanting to fit into social circles that measured worth differently than we'd raised him to do. I thought about Margaret's letter to Ethan, the one she'd written but never given him on his 18th birthday. Her hope that he would remember where he came from, that he would value the foundations we'd tried to give him. She'd been wrong about that, at least partially. But she'd been right about something else, that the strongest foundations were built on respect and gratitude, and the understanding that we all stand on the shoulders of people who loved us first. I still stood on those shoulders, my parents' example of hard work and integrity, Margaret's gift of unconditional love, the lessons learned from 40 years of marriage to someone who made me better than I would have been alone. Those foundations hadn't been shaken by today's confrontation. If anything, they'd been reinforced. The house settled around me as the evening deepened, its familiar sounds a comfort that no senior living facility could replicate. The soft creak of the oak floors Margaret had insisted on refinishing ourselves. The whisper of wind through the eaves where I'd installed proper insulation during the energy crisis of the 70s. The gentle tick of the grandfather clock we'd bought for our 25th anniversary. Its steady rhythm marking time in a home where time had been treasured rather than simply endured. I made myself a final cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had planned our dreams and weathered our sorrows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, probably new attempts to pressure or manipulate me into changing my mind. Ethan wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and I suspected this morning's confrontation had been more of a first salvo than a final battle. But I was ready for whatever came next. The legal protections were in place, the community support was real, and most importantly, I finally understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. Margaret was gone, and that grief would always be part of me. But her love remained in every choice I made to honor what we'd built together, every decision to protect rather than surrender what we'd valued. I thought about the swing on the front porch, about the garden she'd planted, about the rooms where we'd been happy together for 40 years. This wasn't just where I lived, it was where I belonged, and belonging, I'd learned today, was worth fighting for. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, its headlights sweeping across the kitchen window. Not Ethan this time. I could tell from the sound of the engine. Just a neighbor coming home from a late shift, someone else who belonged in this community we'd all built together through decades of ordinary kindness and mutual respect. I finished my coffee, checked the new locks Tom had insisted I install, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom Margaret and I had shared for 40 years. Her pillow still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she'd kept in her dresser drawers. Her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand, where she'd left them the last time she'd been strong enough to hold a book. "I kept my promise," I whispered to the darkness. "I'm taking care of what we built." And for the first time since her funeral, I slept through the night without waking. Right true if you agree with the father character.